It's like inescapable these days, right? You get these, what do they call them, record highs, then bam, massive crashes. Makes you wonder, what's the deal with this whole Bitcoin thing? Well, that's what we're diving into today, getting into the nitty-gritty of Bitcoin. We got some really interesting articles here, Wikipedia, Forbes Advisor, even Coinbase to help us unpack it all.
Yeah, it's a hot topic, that's for sure.
No kidding. So for anyone listening who's heard the word Bitcoin thrown around but doesn't totally get it, don't worry. By the end of this deep dive, you have a much clearer picture. We're going to break down what it is, why it matters, all that good stuff.
Exactly. And one of the most fascinating things about Bitcoin is that it was actually the very first decentralized digital currency. The OG, the one that kicked off this whole new world of digital finance.
Right, decentralized. That's the key word there. But what does it actually mean in practice? Imagine, for a second, a currency that's not controlled by any government or like a big bank, no Federal Reserve, no central authority calling the shots. That's the big idea behind Bitcoin.
And another really interesting aspect is its scarcity. Unlike, say, the US dollar, which the government can technically print more of whenever, Bitcoin has a fixed limit. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins in existence.
Whoa, so it's like finite.
Precisely. This built-in scarcity is a major reason why people compare Bitcoin to digital gold.
Digital gold, huh? I kind of like that analogy. Helps to wrap your head around it. And hey, just like with gold, you don't need to buy a whole Bitcoin to get in on the action, right? That's where Satoshi comes in, am I right?
You got it. A Satoshi is the smallest unit of a Bitcoin. Think of it like cents to the dollar, but way more divisible.
So you're saying I could own like a fraction of a Bitcoin?
Absolutely. You can own a tiny piece of it, which makes it more accessible than some people realize.
Interesting, interesting. So every time there's a Bitcoin transaction, even if it's just a few Satoshis, it gets recorded somewhere, right? What was that thing called again?
The blockchain. That's the real game changer.
Right, the blockchain.
It's essentially a giant public ledger, like a digital record book that's viewable by anyone. It tracks every single Bitcoin transaction ever made from the very beginning.
So if I were to buy, say, a cup of coffee with Bitcoin.
Yep. That transaction gets added to the blockchain for everyone to see.
Wow, full transparency. That's kind of wild to think about. But how does that even work? Is there like a Bitcoin bank somewhere keeping tabs on all this?
Well, that's the beauty of it. There isn't. No central authority, no single entity controlling everything. The blockchain is actually distributed across a vast network of computers all over the world.
I'm trying to picture it. It's like a shared Google Doc, but for Bitcoin transactions, and no one can mess with it.
You're getting the idea. Each new block of transactions gets linked to the block that came before it, forming this, like, unbreakable chain of information, hence the blockchain.
Clever. Okay, so if there's no central authority, who's in charge of verifying all these transactions and making sure they're legit?
This is where it gets even cooler. The verification process is handled by a global network of people we call miners.
Wait, miners? Like with pickaxes and hard hats?
Right.
What do they mine exactly?
Haha, not quite. In the Bitcoin world, miners use powerful computers to solve super complex mathematical problems. Imagine a massive Sudoku puzzle that everyone's racing to solve, but with computers instead of pencils.
So it's like a digital gold rush, but instead of digging for gold, they're crunching numbers.
Exactly. And just like a gold rush, there are rewards for those who succeed. The first miner to crack the code gets to add the next block of transactions to the blockchain, and they get rewarded with Bitcoin for their efforts.
Ah, so there's an incentive to keep the whole system running. Smart. But with all these computers churning away 2047, doesn't that eat up a ton of energy?
That's a valid concern. Bitcoin mining does require a significant amount of electricity, which has sparked debates about its environmental impact. It's definitely something to consider when you're looking at the bigger picture of Bitcoin.
For sure, for sure. Okay, so we've got this digital currency. It's decentralized, secure, and maintained by this network of miners all over the world. But how does Bitcoin actually function in the real world? Like, how are people using it?
That's a great question because the uses are constantly evolving. One of the most common ways people use Bitcoin is as an investment.
Right, just like investing in stocks or bonds or even real estate. I've heard people call Bitcoin a store of value, even a hedge against inflation.
Exactly. And just like any investment, Bitcoin's value can fluctuate, sometimes pretty dramatically. It can be a bit of a roller coaster ride.
That's for sure. Forbes Advisor mentioned how the financial media loves to cover Bitcoin's price swings, probably why it feels like we're always hearing about it, right? But besides the whole investment angle, what are some other ways people are actually using Bitcoin?
Well, remember how we talked about Bitcoin as an alternative to traditional government-controlled currencies? This is where it gets really interesting. In countries experiencing hyperinflation or economic instability, people are turning to Bitcoin as a way to protect their savings.
Right, because if your local currency is rapidly losing value, I remember Coinbase highlighting Venezuela and Argentina as examples. Bitcoin offers a more stable alternative in those kinds of situations,
Yeah,
right?
precisely. It gives people in those countries a way to participate in a global economy, even if their own local economy is struggling. And then, of course, you have a growing number of businesses worldwide that accept Bitcoin as payment for goods and services.
Oh, yeah. Didn't someone buy pizzas with Bitcoin way back in the day, like a long time ago?
You're thinking of Laszlo Hanyecz and the infamous Bitcoin Pizza Day. It's become a legendary story in the crypto world.
Right. Didn't he pay something crazy like 10,000 Bitcoins for those pizzas? Can you imagine what those would be worth today? Talk about an expensive pizza night.
It just goes to show how much Bitcoin's value has increased over the years, but it also highlights that Bitcoin is still a relatively young technology. Its future is full of exciting possibilities, but also uncertainties.
No doubt about that. So this all begs the question, should people be investing in Bitcoin?
Ugh, the million-dollar question, or should we say, the multi-thousand Bitcoin one. The truth is, there's no easy answer.
No crystal ball, unfortunately. But we've got to unpack this a bit further. What are some of the potential benefits and risks people should be aware of? What did our sources have to say about all this? So we've been talking a lot about potential upsides, but I got to ask, what about the downsides? What are the risks that people should be aware of before they, jump on the Bitcoin bandwagon?
Well, the biggest one, and this is something that comes up in pretty much every article we looked at, is the volatility. Bitcoin's price can swing like crazy, making it a pretty risky investment, especially if you're not super familiar with how markets work.
Yeah, it's definitely not for the, what they call it, the risk-averse investor.
Mm.
Forbes Advisor actually had a whole section on this, talking about how even experienced investors can get caught up in the hype. It's easy to get swept up when you see those prices skyrocketing, thinking, this is it, I'm going to be rich.
Yeah.
But then, just as quickly, it can all come crashing down.
Exactly. It's a roller coaster, that's for sure. And then there's the whole regulatory landscape, which is still very much under construction, I guess you could say. Governments all over the world are trying to figure out how to handle Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general.
Right, and it's like the Wild West out there. Speaking of governments, didn't El Salvador make Bitcoin legal tender? I remember reading about that on Wikipedia. That was a pretty bold move, right?
It was a huge deal. I mean, a country actually adopting Bitcoin as an official currency, that's unprecedented. But it's still too early to say what the long-term impact will be. Will other countries follow their lead? Will they try to create their own digital currencies? Or will they crack down on crypto altogether?
Man, who knows? It really does feel like we're at a crossroads here. On the one hand, you've got this incredible technology that could potentially revolutionize the way we think about money and finance. But on the other hand, there are legitimate concerns about its stability, its security, and its long-term viability.
Yeah, it's a classic case of innovation versus tradition,
Yeah.
And like any major technological shift, there are bound to be some winners and some losers along the way.
Okay, so bottom line, for the average person out there who's trying to wrap their head around all of this, what's the key takeaway? What advice would you give someone who's thinking about dipping their toes into the world of Bitcoin?
I'd say the most important thing is to approach it with a healthy dose of both curiosity and caution. Don't be afraid to ask questions, do your research, and definitely don't invest more than you can afford to lose.
Solid advice for any investment, really.
Yeah.
But I think what's really fascinating about Bitcoin is that it goes beyond just being a currency or even an investment. It's really forcing us to rethink our whole relationship with money, with technology, and maybe even with power itself.
Totally. I mean, it's literally challenging the status quo. It's asking us to imagine a future where financial systems are more open, more transparent, and more accessible to everyone. Whether that vision becomes reality, well, that remains to be seen. But there's no denying that Bitcoin has sparked a global conversation, one that's not going away anytime soon.
And that, my friends, is why we love doing these deep dives. We've covered a ton of ground today, from the nitty-gritty of blockchain and mining to the real-world implications and the potential future of Bitcoin. Hopefully you're feeling a little more informed, a little less intimidated, and a lot more curious about this whole world of cryptocurrency.
It's a wild ride, that's for sure. And this is really just the beginning of the journey. As you continue to explore the world of Bitcoin, keep asking questions, keep learning, and who knows, maybe you'll be part of shaping the future of finance yourself.
So we've covered a lot about what Bitcoin is, but I'm really curious about the what if. Is this really the future of money or just a passing trend? What did our sources say about where things go from here?
Yeah, that's the billion-dollar question, right? And honestly, the articles we looked at, they don't have a crystal ball, obviously, but they do highlight some pretty exciting possibilities and, of course, potential risks, too. Can't forget those.
Right, got to keep it real. So let's break it down. What are the biggest pros and cons that people should be thinking about?
Well, on the plus side, the big one is independence. Traditional currencies, they're controlled by governments, central banks, you name it. Bitcoin, not so much.
Right, that decentralization thing we talked about.
Exactly. And for a lot of people, that's a huge draw. It's about having more control over your own money, especially if you're concerned about, economic uncertainty, government overreach, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially after reading those examples from Coinbase about countries with unstable economies.
Yeah.
Bitcoin gives people options they might not otherwise have. But okay, what about the other side of the coin? What are the experts saying about the potential downsides?
Well, the big one, and this has kind of been a recurring theme, is the volatility. Bitcoin's price can be all over the place, making it a pretty risky investment, especially if you're new to this whole world.
For sure. It's not for the faint of heart. Remember that section in Forbes Advisor about how even seasoned investors can get caught up in the hype?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's easy to get swept away when you see those headlines about Bitcoin's price skyrocketing, but then, bam, it can come crashing down just as quickly.
Exactly. Definitely a roller coaster ride. And then there's the whole regulatory side of things, which seems like it's still a work in progress.
Totally. I mean, governments around the world are still trying to figure out how to handle Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general. It's like a whole new ball game for them.
Yeah, Wikipedia even mentioned that whole thing with El Salvador making Bitcoin legal tender, which seemed pretty huge at the time. But it sounds like a lot of other countries are taking a wait-and-see approach.
Which makes sense. It's a pretty bold move to just dive headfirst into something as new and untested as Bitcoin. I mean, who knows what the long-term consequences will be? Will other countries follow suit? Will they create their own digital currencies instead? Or try to shut it all down?
It's like we're at this crazy turning point.
Hmm.
On the one hand, you've got this revolutionary technology with the potential to totally upend the financial system as we know it. But then there are these valid concerns. Is it stable enough? Is it secure enough? Will it even be around in 10 years? Who knows?
Exactly. And like any major technological shift, there are going to be winners and losers along the way. It's just the way these things work.
Okay, so bottom line, for the everyday person who's just trying to make sense of all this Bitcoin buzz,
Yeah.
what's the key takeaway? What should they be thinking about?
I'd say approach it with a healthy mix of curiosity and caution. Don't be afraid to dive in and learn as much as you can, but also don't get caught up in the hype.
Easier said than done, right?
Totally. But honestly, the more informed you are, the better equipped you'll be to navigate this whole new world.
Couldn't agree more. And that's what we're all about here, right? Giving you the information you need to make your own decisions. We've covered a ton of ground today, from the basics of blockchain and mining to the potential benefits and risks of investing in Bitcoin, and even what the future might hold. Hopefully, you're walking away feeling a little more informed and a lot less intimidated by this whole world of cryptocurrency.
Absolutely. And remember, this is a constantly evolving space, so stay curious, stay informed. Who knows? You might just find yourself at the forefront of the next big financial revolution.
Now, that's something to think about. Thanks for diving in with us today. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the world's most fascinating topics.